How's it going, guys? We're back to the French Revolution Part 3.2. All right. In the last installment, we discussed the breakout of the French Revolution. We reviewed the tennis court oath, the storming of the Bastille. We talked about the Great Fear, and then we kind of ended talking about the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. And really, the last slide, we were mentioning how women made some gains, but were still considered second-class citizens. So we're going to begin 3.2 with the further discussion of women and their involvement in the Revolution up until this point. So, women in the Revolution, which is in Key Concept 2.1. What about the rights of women? It's really important for you all to be able to give and recognize examples of women enthusiastically participating in the early phases of the French Revolution. This is imperative because Key Concept 2.14e is on the AP curriculum, but it's also important to recognize that there were brief improvements in the legal status of women, but then citizenship in republic was restricted to men. We have discussed the rights of man and citizen, but what about the ladies? Again, they made some gains. They increased the rights to divorce, inherit property, and get child support from the fathers of their illegitimate children, but that's where it ended. All right. The fact was that women at this stage were not created equal. They could not vote. They couldn't hold office. A system gave males the advantage in family law, property rights, and education. So the Declaration of Man prompted somebody named Olympe de Gouges. You got to know her. And she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen in 1791. And what she did was she applied each of the 17 articles of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen to women's rights. She wanted equal education and women's suffrage. She asserted the right to divorce under certain conditions. She asserted the right to control property in marriage and to have equal access to higher education and civilian careers and public employment. Here are 3 other examples that would really benefit you to learn. There was a lady named Mary Wollstonecraft, and she wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. She defended de Gouges' ideas that she wrote in the Declaration of the Rights of Female Citizens, or the rights of women. She said that civilized women are, therefore, so weakened by false refinement that respecting morals, their condition is much below what it would be were they left in a state nearer to nature. To remain, it may be said, innocent. They mean in a state of childhood. Fragile in every sense of the word, they are obliged to look up to man for every comfort. If fear in girls, instead of being cherished, perhaps were treated in the same manner as cowardice in boys, we should quickly see that women with more dignified aspects. I do not wish them to have power over man, but over themselves. So again, we have early feminists, if you will, calling for more rights and equality for women. Another lady is Madame de Staël. She ran a salon and wrote widely read books. She opposed the subordination of women that the Revolution did so little to change. And then the third event is the Women's March to Versailles, and it happened early on the morning of October 5th, 1789. Angry women stormed down the streets of Paris to the Palace of Versailles during the French Revolution, with the purpose of obtaining bread by force and demanding that the prices go back to where they were. There were bread shortages, we've talked about inflation, and many of these women could not feed their families. Bread was the main staple of the French diet, as we've already talked about at this time in history, and the working class spent over half their wages just to buy the food. However, in August of 1789, prices of bread rose due to lack of bread being produced and nationwide inflation. This march was incited by Jean-Paul Marat. More on him later. But he was a pamphleteer who wanted to push the revolution forward for France's sake, but also for his newspaper. So 7,000 women read this, got angry, and demanded the king redress economic grievances. Women actually invaded the royal apartments, slaughtering the bodyguards of the crown while searching for Queen Marie Antoinette. And the significance of this is really of the utmost importance. The king and queen were forced to move from Paris to live at the Tuileries Palace, the royal residence in Paris of the crown. So they became now prisoners of Paris and the Revolution. And in addition, the National Assembly also moved from Versailles to Paris. And this is where the Revolution would become more radical, as the Assembly became intimidated by more radical Parisians. So they start making reforms once the king moves to Paris. They forced judicial reforms. There was no parliament court system. And if you remember, the king was able to appoint justice officials to pretty much force his will in centralization process. The new system of lower and higher courts were established. They democratized the system of justice. There was no more torture. Judges were elected for 6-year terms, and they used juries in all criminal cases. So again, we have more enlightened judicial reforms. Similarly, we have Enlightenment economic reforms. They upheld the laissez-faire doctrine and abolished trade guilds. They wanted everything open for freedom. All occupations were open up to all classes, and there were no more internal tolls or customs. So free trade within the borders of France. Religiously, we see a lot of enlightened reform. This is where things get a little crazy. So what we need to know is the civil constitution of the clergy. It in effect secularized religion, created a national church with 83 bishops and dioceses. Probably the biggest blunder of the National Assembly. All right? So they confiscated all the land, they abolished the monasteries. The clergy now became elected by the people, not by the Pope, and the salaries were to be paid not by the Catholic Church or the French Church, but by the state. So again, they reduced the amount of bishops, and they reduced how wealthy the church was. And as you can imagine, the backlash to this is going to be monumental. Protestant, Jews, agnostics could legally take part in the elections of the priests and in the church because it was based on citizenship and property qualifications. So the clergy, when they were elected, were forced to take an oath of loyalty to the new government, since the Pope had, at this point, condemned the revolution. So we have, some really, the result of the civil constitution of the clergy was deeply divided France over the issue of religion. Obviously, the Pope's going to condemn the act as an attempt to subjugate the church, and half of French priests refused to accept it. These priests that refuse to accept the civil constitution are called refractory clergy. You'll hear me talk about refractory priests. So this is going to be one of the first splinters of the ranks of the revolutionaries, because people, like I said, are going to be deeply divided on what this is all about. Financial reforms. They made some enlightened financial reforms where there was no more unequal taxation. Everybody paid their fair share. Taxes were now based on land and profits from trade and industry. And they issued new money called assignats, which established and backed by confiscated church land. So they sold the church land that they confiscated and used it to back currency. It became paper currency, something they didn't have before. And, like I said, the church land was sold to pay off the national debt. Much of it was purchased by the peasants. More on this later. As you can see by this cartoon, this rendition of the civil constitution of the clergy, they paint the image of the priests being fat and too wealthy, so they're going to squeeze them in a vice, squeeze the money out of them, and help pay for the debt and to try to provide some relief for the peasants in the lower class. And a lot of texts say that the civil constitution of the clergy has been viewed as a serious blunder on the part of the National Assembly, mainly because by arousing opposition to the church, the fact that many people started to be very conservative in their views about the church and daily life, and it gave the counter-revolutionaries a popular platform on which to stand opposed to the French Revolution. And it was easier for the revolutionaries as radicals and extremists, as you will soon see, an easy sell. As you can see on this chart, the assignats were an initial stopgap to the economic woes of the French economic slump. But as you can see here, through inflation, as the revolution and war progresses, this made paper currency useless by the time Napoleon comes to town. All right, and so this is going to be a point of contention a little bit later on with the peasants, that this paper currency will eventually be worthless. So in terms of new reform, in terms of politics, we have the Constitution of 1791. And the Constitution of 1791 will establish 3 branches of government: the executive, judicial, and legislative. So France, under the Constitution of 1791, officially becomes a constitutional monarchy. You must know that. Lawmaking abilities were given to the legislative branch, which was a unicameral, one house, of 745 elected officials for 2-year terms. The king could veto all but constitutional and financial bills. But 3 times through, the legislature could override the king's veto. The king's budget was limited by the Legislative Assembly. France was divided into 83 departments governed by elected local authorities. Voting was limited to 25-year-olds plus. Also, you had to be a tax-paying male. Holding political office limited to what amounted to the middle and upper class, so wealthier males. The bourgeoisie seemed now to have all the power. And as many nobles were not elected, and we've already talked about a lot of them were leaving. So as you can see, though, there were not major reform. There weren't major reforms on many of the people that were elected for the masses. The bourgeoisie protected their newly acquired privileges and really were only out to serve their own interests and not everyone. In October of 1791, the Legislative Assembly that was created by the new Constitution took over for the National Assembly, which had served its purpose in creating a new French government. Opposition from within. Did the revolution go far enough? Well, there was no utopian peace in France now that they had embarked on the path of an enlightened constitutional monarchy. As we stated at this point, it was more of an upper-middle class bourgeoisie victory, and many wanted to stop here. There were many people that weren't happy, as it turns out. Who was not happy? Well, many clerics and commoners alike were upset with the civil constitution of the clergy. Parisians, clergy, soldiers, and the aristocracy were not happy, however, and had many diverse interests that they wanted to see addressed. Inflation of the assignats hurt the lower classes as the cost of living or inflation went up and the paper currency lost its value. Political clubs started merging in the spirit of the Enlightenment that offered more far-reaching and radical solutions to the woes of France. The most famous of these clubs was the Jacobin Club. They occupied the former Jacobin convent in Paris. These groups spread throughout the provinces in France, and discussion groups emerged. They emerged as a veritable political force as they joined together by 1791, and their headquarters was in that very Jacobin convent in downtown Paris. The Jacobins included the social elite, societal elite, artisans, and trade people. So as we said, these political clubs, in particular the Jacobins, were meeting and discussing more far-reaching and radical solutions to the problem that was plaguing the new government in France. All right? And we need to understand some of the big dogs of the Jacobins. They included Marat, Danton, George Danton, and Maximilien Robespierre. They formed the core of this famous radical group called the Jacobins, and this group wanted to end the monarchy and extend the revolution. In here you see a picture of the Jacobin meeting house right here. They held this in the former Jacobin monastery in Paris, and they started this debating society, and again, mostly members of the middle class. They wanted to get rid of the monarchy, and soon, you know what, stay tuned, that will happen. So opposition from within continued. The flight to Varennes. June 10, 1791, Louis XVI tried to escape France to avoid approving the Constitution of 1791 and to raise a counter-revolutionary army with émigré noblemen and to seek help from foreign powers, especially foreign monarchs who didn't want to see this French Revolution successful. He was captured, and the king and queen became prisoners of the Parisian mobs. Louis was forced to accept the constitutional monarchy. This turns out to be one of the worst things Louis could have done. At this point of the revolution, most people were genuinely excited about the possibility of a constitutional monarchy moving forward. However, Louis had undercut the revolution. He became an enemy of the revolution. He almost succeeded in ending it before he was recognized by an innkeeper. A commoner recognized the king and ratted him out. So initially he was captured, as I said, and brought to Paris. Many moderates who didn't like the radicals calling for a republic or an end to the monarchy acted as though the king was kidnapped. However, the radicals, especially the Jacobins, with their pamphlets, made sure that this was highly publicized, and it was not the case. He wasn't kidnapped, he was trying to flee. He now became an enemy of the revolution.